Heterosexual sin is sin. So we need to be careful when we lift up the broad concept of heterosexuality without any qualifications. We could actually be inadvertently endorsing sin.
The last thing you said is that of a biblical identity or a Christ-centered identity, and how your identity is no longer wrapped up in being a homosexual. However, that placing your identity in heterosexuality isn't exactly the right thing either, because the word doesn't say be heterosexual as I am heterosexual or be homosexual as I am homosexual. Talk a little bit more about that identity piece and how oftentimes as believers, we can misplace our identity, or just as humans. I think this is a human problem as well. But in the church, we will place our identity in heterosexuality. I am heterosexual, thus I am saved, I am a Christian, and all of these things, versus, the homosexual, that person is not, because they are homosexual. So then our salvation is based on these sexual acts, or where we place our identity in regards to sexuality.
Yes. Yeah. And I do want to be clear. Homosexuality, putting your identity in that, there's nothing good about that. It's all sinful. The desires, even and we'll talk about this later, this concept of orientation, which I think is not a biblical concept, which equates somehow your predisposition with your identity and your personhood. Identity sometimes is misunderstood as if like how you identify. That's not what we're talking about. Identify are labels. Identity is talking about essence, personhood, ontology. But what I want to be clear, homosexuality is the worst. It's not. I'm sorry, not the worst, but it is worse than because it's sinful. Now, heterosexuality, there is some good in man and woman in marriage. Not any man, not any woman. See, this is where my critique of heterosexuality, obviously the homosexuality is all sinful. Heterosexuality, we do have one example, man and woman, and specifically not just any man and not just any woman, but specifically husband and wife in marriage is blessed by God. My issue with the concept of heterosexuality is not that it's fully wrong. It's not. It's just not fully right. So what I think God's word is always challenging us. As Jesus came in the first century, he was challenging us to become as biblical and precise as possible. Heterosexuality, it's not fully correct. What do I mean? The concept is so broad that it includes concepts like adultery between a man and a woman. They're not married. Sex before marriage, fornication, people who aren't married. And so the concept of heterosexuality, it's too broad, and it's a secular Freudian concept. So we must always be more precise. When we use too broad of a category, it can not be very clear of what is God's complete, perfect, precise, accurate calling. And it kind of clouds the water. When the world is muddying the water, we shouldn't add to the muddiness. So that's why we need to be very, very precise. And actually hear this often in the church. Well, at least my son, he's not gay. He's sleeping with his girlfriend. I mean, that's not too bad. Pornography, we're not hurting anyone. Heterosexual sin is sin. So we need to be careful when we lift up the broad concept of heterosexuality without any qualifications. We could actually be inadvertently actually endorsing sin. We need to be very precise, which is why God, I was like, we need a very accurate, precise definition. And this is where, my book, Holy Sexuality and the Gospel, and the video series, the Holy Sexuality Project, wants to give Christians and the world the most accurate description of what God is calling us to. The term heterosexuality, to be honest, says nothing about how you and I ought to live. We're both single. Yeah. I'm open to getting married. If the goal is to be attracted to the opposite sex, then that means I would be sinning. You would be sinning. If right now the goal for you is to be sexually attracted to men, you're not married. Any man that you're sexually attracted to, any woman that I'm sexually attracted to, any desires that I have, those desires are sinful. I need to resist those. That's why it's chastity in singleness or faithfulness in marriage. Heterosexuality does not communicate chastity and singleness. So that's why we needed a much more precise, robust talking about the two conditions that human beings find themselves when it comes to relationships. What, you're unmarried. Every one of us are unmarried starting at birth. Like, I've never met anyone who was born married. So that's default. Singly, we're default. And yet many will marry. And I just want to be very, very clear to your listeners and watchers. There's only one definition of marriage that we find in the Bible that Jesus gives when he was asked about divorce, Matthew 19 and Mark chapter 10. And his answer goes back to Genesis 1:27, Genesis 2:24. Created made the male and female, the two shall become one flesh. What God has put together, let man not separate. So we see that marriage, there's only one definition, God's definition there. The world has distorted that definition to be anything, and that's wrong. But marriage between one man and one woman, and when God, provides that, then the call is to be faithful to your spouse of the opposite sex. So holy sexuality definition is just chastity in singleness or faithfulness in marriage.